The Impossible Choice: How a Pilot Saved 12 Lives by Shooting Down His Own. Part 1. 15 Seconds to Eternity. There is a moment in every life when time stops. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally, viscerally, completely. A moment when the universe narrows to a single point, and everything you have ever been, everything you will ever become, hangs suspended in the space between one heartbeat and the next. For Lieutenant Louis Kurds. That moment came at 4:47 in the afternoon on February 10th, 1945, 3,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. Below him, a Douglas C-47 Skytrain descended toward an airstrip on Bataan Island. American markings, white star on the fuselage, 12 souls aboard, who had no idea they were about to land in the hands of the enemy. Louis had 15 seconds. 15 seconds to make a choice that no training manual had ever covered. 15 seconds to decide between two impossible options. 15 seconds that would define not just his life, but the lives of 12 strangers and one woman who would become his wife. But before we can understand what happened in those 15 seconds, we need to understand the man who faced them. Because the choices we make in our darkest moments are not born from nothing. They are forged in the fires of everything that came before. And Louis Kurds had walked through fire more times than most men could imagine. Here is the first truth this story will teach you. The decisions that matter most are rarely the ones we have time to think about. They are the ones that emerge, fully formed, from the depths of who we truly are. And who we truly are is determined by every choice we have ever made, every hardship we have ever faced, every moment of courage and cowardice that has shaped our character. Louis Kurds did not become the man who could make that impossible choice in 15 seconds. He had been becoming that man his entire life. Part 2. The Boy Who Looked Up, Fort Wayne, Indiana, 1925. A 6-year-old boy stands in a muddy field at the edge of Smithfield, his neck craned back so far his mother worries he will fall over. Above him, a biplane traces lazy circles against the autumn sky. The engine sputters and coughs. The fabric wings catch the light, and something ignites in the boy's chest that will never go out. His name is Louis Edward Kurds. His father sells real estate. His mother teaches school. They live in a modest house on a quiet street in a city where nothing extraordinary ever seems to happen. But Louis does not see the ordinary world around him. He sees the sky. "What are you looking at?" his mother asks, though she already knows. "I'm going to do that someday," Louis says. He does not say it like a child making wishes. He says it like a man stating facts. His mother smiles and ruffles his hair. She has no way of knowing that her son has just made a promise to himself, a promise he will keep through depression and war, through triumph and tragedy, through 9 months of walking through enemy territory and a lifetime of memories that will haunt his dreams. This is what we must understand about purpose. It does not arrive with fanfare. It does not announce itself with certainty. It whispers to us in quiet moments, and we must be brave enough to listen. Louis listened. Throughout his childhood, he returned to that field again and again. He watched the planes take off and land. He learned to identify them by their silhouettes, by the sound of their engines, by the way they moved through the air. Other boys played baseball or chased girls or dreamed of being movie stars. Louis dreamed of flight. When the Depression hit in 1929, his family struggled like everyone else. His father's real estate business crumbled. Some nights, dinner was nothing more than bread and whatever vegetables his mother could coax from their small garden. But Louis never complained. He worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and spent his free time at the airfield, doing whatever chores the pilots would let him do in exchange for a few minutes of their wisdom. By the time he enrolled at Purdue University in 1938, he had logged dozens of hours of informal flight instruction. He could talk about aircraft the way other young men talked about automobiles or sports teams. He knew the specifications of every plane in the American inventory, and quite a few foreign ones as well. He was 19 years old, and he was ready, but the world was not. Part 3, The Eve of Everything, December 6th, 1941. A Saturday. Louis walks out of his Purdue dormitory into a gray Indiana afternoon. He has been thinking about this moment for weeks. The news from Europe grows darker by the day. Hitler's armies have conquered France, bombed Britain, invaded Russia. The Japanese Empire expands across Asia like a spreading stain. War is coming to America. Louis can feel it in his bones. He does not know that tomorrow Japanese aircraft will attack Pearl Harbor. He does not know that within 24 hours, recruiting stations across the country will be overwhelmed with young men desperate to serve. He does not know that his decision to walk into that recruiting office on this particular Saturday will give him a 6-month head start on most of his generation. He only knows that he is tired of waiting. The recruiting sergeant looks up from his paperwork with the bored expression of a man who has heard every pitch, every excuse, every story. Help you. Son, I want to fly, Louis says. Army Air Forces. The sergeant's expression does not change. College boy. 3rd year. Purdue. Engineering. Now the sergeant's eyebrow rises, just slightly. College boys are rare. College boys with engineering backgrounds are rarer still. You know there's no war on, right? Officially speaking, Louis smiles. It is not a naive smile. It is the smile of a man who has been paying attention. There will be, and when there is, I want to be ready. The paperwork takes less than an hour. Louis walks out of the recruiting office with his future sealed in an envelope, unaware that he has just made the most important decision of his life. 24 hours later, the world explodes. There is a lesson here that most people never learn. The best time to prepare for the storm is before the clouds appear. By the time everyone else sees the danger, it is often too late to do anything but run. Louis Kurds did not wait for permission. He did not wait for certainty. He did not wait for the world to tell him what to do. He looked at the horizon, saw what was coming, and acted. This capacity for decisive action, for trusting his own judgment when others hesitated, would save his life more times than he could count. It would save the lives of 12 strangers on a doomed transport plane, and it would cost him more than he ever imagined. But that is the nature of courage. It never comes free. Part 4, Forged in Fire. The training was brutal. Primary flight school, basic flight school, advanced flight school. Each stage designed to wash out the weak, the uncertain, the merely adequate. Of the hundreds of young men who began the program with Louis, barely half would earn their wings. Louis excelled, not because he was naturally gifted, though he was, not because he was fearless, though he seemed to be, but because he approached every challenge with the same methodical intensity he had brought to watching planes at Smithfield as a boy. He studied, he practiced, he analyzed every mistake, every near miss, every imperfect landing, and he did not stop until he had mastered whatever skill had eluded him. By December of 1942, he had his wings and a gold bar. Second Lieutenant Louis Kurds, 23 years old, With orders that would take him halfway around the world, the Army handed him a Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was unlike anything else in the American arsenal. Twin engines, twin booms, a distinctive silhouette that made it unmistakable from any angle. The cockpit sat in a central nacelle between the engines, giving the pilot an unobstructed view in every direction, top speed 414 miles per hour, armament 450 caliber machine guns, and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose. German pilots called it Der Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. Louis fell in love instantly. He painted a cartoon devil on the nose, complete with horns, pitchfork, and a mischievous grin. Then, because Louis had a sense of humor that his commanding officers did not always appreciate, he added a halo above the devil's head. He named the plane Good Devil. That's either brilliant or sacrilegious, his crew chief said, studying the artwork. Can't it be both? Louis replied. The crew chief laughed. He would learn, over the months to come, that Louis Kurds was full of contradictions. A killer with a gentle heart, a warrior with a poet's soul, a man who could shoot down 3 enemy planes in a single mission, and then spend the evening writing tender letters to his mother back in Fort Wayne. The contradictions were not weaknesses. They were the source of his strength. Part 5. Blood and Sky. April 29th, 1943. Mediterranean Sea, Louis's first combat mission. The briefing had been straightforward. Escort B-25 bombers to their target. Keep the Germans off them. Come home. Standard procedure. Nothing fancy. Do not play hero. Louis had been in North Africa for 9 days. He had spent those days learning the terrain, studying maps, memorizing emergency procedures, and trying not to think about what it would feel like to kill another human being. Now, at 15,000 feet above the glittering blue water, he was about to find out. Bandits. 12 o'clock high. The call came over the radio like an electric shock. Louis looked up and felt his stomach drop. 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s were diving out of the sun, their silver fuselages catching the light like falling stars. The Bf-109 was the backbone of the Luftwaffe. Single engine, single seat, 398 miles per hour. The pilots flying them had been at war since 1939. Spain, Poland, France, Britain, Russia. 4 years of combat experience against the best pilots Europe had to offer. Louis Kurds had been in a combat zone for 9 days. He had 15 seconds to prove he belonged here. What happens in those moments when theory meets reality? Some men freeze. The training they received, the skills they practiced, the confidence they built, all of it evaporates in the face of actual danger. Their minds go blank. Their hands shake. They become passengers in their own bodies, watching helplessly as death approaches. Other men transform. The pressure that paralyzes most people becomes fuel for them. Time slows down. Their senses sharpen. Everything they have ever learned crystallizes into a single, perfect clarity of purpose. Louis Kurds transformed. The first 109 came at him from above and to the right, its guns blazing. Louis did not panic. He did not freeze. He simply moved. The P-38 rolled left, dropped its nose, and dove beneath the Germans' line of fire as if the 2 aircraft were performing a choreographed dance. Then Louis pulled up, hard, and found himself behind the Messerschmitt. His thumb found the firing button without conscious thought. His tracers, lines of fire visible in the bright Mediterranean sky, walked across the 109's engine cowling, smoke, flame. The German rolled and dropped toward the sea. First kill. But there was no time to celebrate. Another 109 was on the tail of a P-38 from his squadron. Louis could hear the pilot's panicked voice over the radio, calling for help that might not come in time. Louis broke formation. This was against doctrine. This was against orders. This was the kind of impulsive action that got young pilots killed. But Louis did not care about doctrine or orders. He cared about the man who was about to die. He dove into the fight, his cannons blazing. The rounds tore through the Messerschmitt's wing root. The German spun out of control, trailing smoke and debris. Second kill. The 109's wingman tried to escape. A sensible choice, his flight leader was down. The odds had shifted. Survival demanded retreat. But Louis followed him down to 500 feet, so close to the water that the spray from his propeller left a trail of mist behind him. A 3-second burst. The Messerschmitt cartwheeled into the waves. Third kill. 3 kills. First mission. Louis landed at his airfield with fuel tanks nearly empty and hands that would not stop shaking. It was only then, standing on solid ground, that the reality of what he had done began to sink in. He had killed 3 men. 3 men who had woken up this morning with plans and hopes and fears. 3 men who had families waiting for them. Letters they would never write. Futures they would never see. 3 men who were now dead because Louis Kurds had been faster, luckier, better. His squadron commander found him sitting alone in the shadows of the hangar, staring at nothing. First kills are the hardest, the commander said. He sat down beside Louis, offering a cigarette that Louis declined. It gets easier. Does it? Louis asked. The commander was quiet for a long moment. No, he finally admitted. But you learn to carry it. You learn that if it wasn't them, it would have been you. It would have been the boys you flew with, the bombers you were protecting. He paused. You did good today. Kurds, you saved lives. I took lives. Both things are true. That's the hell of it. That's war. Here is a truth that comfortable people do not want to hear. Sometimes, doing the right thing requires doing terrible things. Sometimes, protecting the innocent means destroying the guilty. Sometimes, the hero and the killer are the same person. This is not a comfortable truth. It does not fit neatly into moral categories. It does not offer easy answers or simple absolutions. But it is true nonetheless. Louis Kurds was learning this truth. He would continue learning it over and over again until it was written into his bones. On Part 6, the Ace May, 1943, 2 more kills over Sardinia. That made 5. Louis was an ace, a designation that carried weight and glory in the fighter pilot community. He had achieved it in 4 weeks of combat, a pace that marked him as exceptional, even among the exceptional. But Louis did not celebrate, he did not swagger or boast. He studied his gun camera footage, analyzed his mistakes, and looked for ways to improve. You're strange. Kurds, one of his squadron mates observed. Most guys with 5 kills would be painting their planes and chasing nurses. Most guys with 5 kills are dead within 6 months, Louis replied. I intend to live longer than that. June 24th, 1943, Louis spotted a fighter he did not recognize. Sleek, elegant, with Italian markings. A Machi C-202. Folgore Italy's best. More maneuverable than the Bf 109 flown by pilots who knew every trick in the book. What followed was 3 minutes of pure aerial combat. Turns, reversals, vertical climbs, and plunging dives. The P-38 had more power. The Machi had a tighter turning radius. Each pilot exploited his aircraft's strengths, while probing for the other's weaknesses. Lewis won by thinking 3 moves ahead. He pulled into a vertical climb, letting the Machi follow him up. The Italian pilot was good. He stayed on Louis's tail, waiting for the moment when the P-38's energy would bleed away and it would stall. But Lewis was counting on exactly that. At the top of the climb, with his engine screaming and his airspeed dropping toward 0, Lewis kicked the rudder and let the P-38 fall over the top in a hammerhead stall. For a fraction of a second, he was pointing straight down at the earth, with the Machi directly beneath him. One burst. The Fulgor came apart. 6 victories. 2 different air forces. August 1943. 2 more BF-1. 09s fell to his guns. 8 confirmed kills. Lewis was one of the deadliest pilots in the Mediterranean theater. His name appeared in dispatches. His photograph was printed in newspapers back home. He received letters from strangers telling him he was a hero. Lewis read the letters, felt nothing, and went back to studying his gun camera footage. He was not a hero. He was a professional, and professionals did not rest on their laurels. But even professionals have limits. Even the best pilots make mistakes. And Louis Kurds was about to discover, in the most brutal way possible, that luck is not a permanent companion. Part 7. The fall August 27th, 1943. Naples. The mission was supposed to be routine. Escort B-25 bombers to their target. Keep the Germans off them. Come home. The Germans had other plans. 50 fighters rose to meet them. BF-109s and FW-190s. A wall of metal and fire that seemed to stretch across the entire horizon. The P-38s were outnumbered 4-1. Standard doctrine said disengage. Protect the bombers. Do not get drawn into a fight you cannot win. But then Lewis heard a voice over the radio. One of his wingmen, young kid from Ohio, barely 20 years old. 3. 109s on his tail. 30 seconds from dying. Help somebody help me. There. The transmission cut off. Lewis did not think. He did not weigh options or calculate odds. He simply turned his aircraft toward 50 German fighters, alone. He got 2 of them, but the third got behind him. Cannon rounds punched through his left engine. The P-38 shuddered. Fire warning light. Smoke filling the cockpit. Controls going mushy. Lewis had maybe 30 seconds before the plane became unflyable. He did the math in his head. He was over enemy territory. If he bailed out, he would be captured, but if he stayed with the plane, he might be able to reach the coast. He stayed with the plane. The P-38 came down hard on a beach near Naples, belly landing. Sand spraying everywhere. The impact threw Lewis against his harness, with enough force to crack 2 ribs. But he was alive. He had maybe 5 minutes before German patrols arrived, maybe less. Lewis grabbed his .45 caliber pistol, climbed out of the wrecked cockpit, and set the P-38 on fire. Whatever secrets it contained would die with it. Then he ran for the tree line. He did not make it. Part 8. The Long Walk Home. The Italian prison camp was chaos. Italy was tearing itself apart in the summer of 1943. Mussolini had been deposed in July. The new government was secretly negotiating surrender with the Allies. German troops were flooding south to take control of their former Allies' territory. The guards knew what was coming. When the Germans arrived, the Gestapo would follow. And the Gestapo had very specific ideas about what to do with Allied prisoners. On September 3, 1943, The radio crackled with news that changed everything. Italy had signed an armistice. The guards made a decision that saved Louis Kurdz's life. They opened the cells, handed out rifles, pointed toward the mountains. "Go," they said. "Before the Germans come, go." 20 Allied officers walked out of that prison camp that night. Americans, British, Canadians, all with the same destination, Allied lines. The problem Allied lines were 150 miles south, through the Apennine Mountains, through German-occupied territory, on foot, in winter. There is a kind of suffering that breaks people, and a kind that forges them. The difference is not in the severity of the suffering. It is not in the circumstances or the odds. It is in the person who faces it. Some people, when confronted with impossible challenges, discover reserves of strength they never knew they had. They find within themselves a determination that cannot be broken, a will that cannot be bent, a spirit that refuses to die. Louis Kurds was one of those people. The Apennines run down Italy's spine like a wall, peaks over 9,000 feet, dense forests with no paths, no roads except the ones the Germans controlled, no shelter except what you could find, no food except what strangers gave you. Luis and his fellow escapees traveled at night, 5 miles on a good night, 2 on a bad one. They navigated by stars when the sky was clear, by compass when it was not, by guesswork when the compass failed. Sleep came in caves, in barns, in abandoned shepherd huts with holes in the roof that let in the snow and the wind and the bitter cold. Food came from Italian farmers who risked execution to help them. A loaf of bread here, some cheese there, never enough, always given with fear in the eyes and a finger pressed to the lips. Silenzio. I tedeschi sparano a chiunque aiuti I prigionieri. Silence. The Germans shoot anyone who helps prisoners. October 1943. Communist partisans found them in the mountains, resistance fighters who had been waging guerrilla war against the fascists since Mussolini fell. Hard men with hard eyes who trusted no one, but they trusted the enemy of their enemy. The partisans provided guides, safe routes around German checkpoints, information about patrol schedules and troop movements. Catholic priests hid them in monasteries, ancient stone buildings where no one asked questions, where Latin prayers echoed off walls that had stood for 1,000 years, where monks in brown robes shared their meager rations without complaint. Louis learned that courage came in many forms. It came in the form of farmers who had nothing but gave anyway, in the form of partisans who killed and died for a freedom they might never see, in the form of priests who chose compassion over self-preservation. It came in the form of 20 men who refused to stop walking. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was brutal. Snow, 6 feet deep in the passes. Temperatures below zero for weeks. Most of them were wearing the same clothes. They had been captured in summer uniforms designed for Mediterranean heat, not alpine cold. One man died along the way, a British wing commander. Pneumonia. They buried him in an unmarked grave and kept moving. There was no time for grief, no energy for mourning, just the next step, and the next, and the next. Louis's feet bled, his ribs, cracked in the crash, ached with every breath. Some nights, the cold was so intense that he was not sure he would wake up in the morning. But he kept walking. What keeps a person going when everything says stop? It is not willpower alone. Willpower is a finite resource that depletes under stress. It is not hope alone. Hope is fragile, easily crushed by circumstance. It is something deeper, something that cannot be named but can only be felt. a refusal to accept defeat that comes from the very core of a person's being. Louis Kurds had that something. He had always had it in the boy who stood at Smithfield and declared he would fly. In the young man who enlisted the day before Pearl Harbor, in the pilot who dove into 50 German fighters to save a single wingman. It was the thing that made him who he was, and it would not let him die in these mountains. 9 months. They walked for 9 months. On May 27th, 1944, Louis Kurds stumbled into Allied lines at Monte Cassino. The battle there had been raging since January. The ancient monastery on the hilltop was rubble. The hillsides were covered with the dead. The air smelled of smoke and cordite and the particular sweetness of bodies left too long in the sun. Louis was wearing Italian peasant clothes. He had not shaved in months. His English came out strange, flavored by 9 months of Italian and silence. The sentries almost shot him as a spy, back in Fort Wayne. His parents had a telegram. Missing in action, presumed dead. His mother had already held the memorial service. Louis Kurds walked back from the grave. Part 9. Returning to the sky, most men would have taken the ticket home. 9 months behind enemy lines. Prisoner of war. Escaped, walked 150 miles through German-occupied territory in winter. That was enough war for anyone. Louis volunteered for more. There was a catch. The Geneva Conventions prohibited escaped prisoners from fighting in the same theater where they had been captured. The logic was sound if the Germans recaptured him. They could torture him for information about the partisans, the farmers, the priests, everyone who had risked their lives to help him escape. Their lives depended on Louis staying out of Europe. Fine, he decided. He would find another war. August 1944. The Pacific, new squadron, 4th Fighter Squadron, 3rd Air Commando Group, new base, the Philippines, new aircraft, a P-51D Mustang. The Mustang was the war's perfect fighter. A Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, 1,490 horsepower, top speed 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Range 1,650 miles, with drop tanks. 650 caliber machine guns with enough ammunition for 18 seconds of continuous fire. Faster than his P-38. More agile, longer range. Louis named it Bad Angel, the opposite of Good Devil. Light and dark. Europe and Pacific. Something about that name felt like prophecy. Part 10-3, Air Forces, February 7th, 1945, southwest of Formosa. Louis spotted a twin-engine aircraft at 12,000 feet, Japanese markings. A Mitsubishi Ki-46, codenamed Dinah by the Allies. Fast, unarmed, built for reconnaissance, built to run. Louis did not give it the chance. One burst. The Ki-46 exploded. 7 German planes, 1 Italian, 1 Japanese, 3 enemy air forces. Only 2 other American pilots in the entire war would match that achievement. But Louis was not finished. 3 days later, he would add a 4th flag to his scoreboard. This one would be red, white, and blue. Part 11. The Impossible Choice. February 10th, 1945. 4:37 in the afternoon. Louis leads a 4-ship flight over the Formosa Strait. They find a Japanese airfield on Bataan Island. Target of opportunity. The 4 Mustangs dive. 2 Japanese fighters destroyed in the air. 3 more burning on the ground. Then Lieutenant Lacroix takes a direct hit. His engine dies. He puts his Mustang down in the Philippine Sea, 300 yards from shore, 300 yards from Japanese-held territory. Louis sends 2 pilots, back to base to call for rescue. Then he goes to work. For 30 minutes, he strafes the Japanese positions. Every time someone moves toward the beach, he puts 50 caliber rounds in front of them. He is burning fuel he cannot spare. He is exposing himself to anti-aircraft fire with every pass. But nobody is capturing his wingman, not while Louis Kurds is still flying. That is when the C-47 appears. The C-47 had taken off from Leyte 5 hours earlier. Routine flight to Manila, 12 souls aboard a crew of 4 and 8 passengers, including 2 Army nurses. It should have been easy. 2 hours in the air, but 2 hours in. They flew into a weather system that was not on any forecast. A tropical depression spinning up from the south. Lightning first. Sheets of white fire outside the cockpit windows. Then turbulence. The aircraft dropping 50 feet. Slamming back up, dropping again. Passengers thrown against the ceiling. The pilot fought the controls, tried to climb above it, tried to descend below it. Nothing worked. Then the radio died. Electrical discharge. The equipment smoked, sparked, went silent. For 2 hours, they flew blind. No navigation, no communication, just a compass, a fuel gauge, and prayer. When they finally broke clear, the fuel gauge was touching red. Nothing looked familiar. Nothing matched the charts. The pilot saw an island, an airfield. He did not question it. He could not. He had no fuel to search for alternatives. He had no way of knowing it was Japanese. Louis sees the C-47 at 150 feet, seconds from touchdown. He tries the radio. American transport. You are approaching a Japanese airfield. Pull up immediately. Nothing. Their radio is dead. He dives in front of the transport, rocks his wings, the universal signal for follow me. The C-47 keeps descending. He fires a burst ahead of the nose. Tracer rounds, lighting up the sky. A warning that cannot be misunderstood. The transport does not waver. The Japanese gunners below are shooting at Louis now. They are not shooting at the C-47. They think it is a captured prize coming home. An American aircraft delivering itself into their hands. Louis has run out of options. 15 seconds. In 15 seconds, that transport will touch down on a Japanese airfield. The 12 Americans aboard will be captured before they understand what has happened. Louis knows what capture means. He knows about the Bataan Death March. 75,000 soldiers forced to walk 65 miles. Anyone who fell was bayoneted. 10,000 dead in 6 days. He knows about the prison camps, 800 calories a day, dysentery, beatings, executions. He knows about the massacres. 150 prisoners at Palawan, herded into shelters and burned alive. Pilots beheaded with samurai swords. 12 Americans are about to experience that. 2 of them are women, unless he stops them. There is no time for deliberation, no time for moral calculus, no time for anything except the choice that has been building inside Louis Kurds since he was 6 years old, standing in a muddy field, watching biplanes trace circles against the sky, the choice that was refined in every mission over North Africa and Italy. The choice that was tempered in 9 months of walking through mountains, of depending on strangers, of learning that sometimes the only way forward is through the impossible. The choice that emerges, fully formed, from the man he has become. Louis swings behind the C-47, lines up on the left engine, and pulls the trigger. The burst is surgical. 50 caliber rounds punch through the left engine. The propeller seizes, but the C-47 keeps flying. One engine can keep it airborne. Louis shifts aim, fires again. The right engine explodes. The pilot of the C-47 is good. He has seconds to react, and he reacts perfectly. He banks toward the water, away from the Japanese airfield. He keeps the wings level as the aircraft descends. He aims for the smoothest patch of sea he can find. The C-47 hits the Philippine Sea at 90 miles per hour. The fuselage holds. Life rafts deploy. 12 survivors in the water. All alive. Lieutenant Lacroix, still floating in his own life, raft 300 yards away. Paddles over to join them. 13 people now. Lewis drops a note. For God's sake, stay away from shore. Jap's there. Then he circles, and circles, and circles. His fuel gauge touches empty. His engine begins to sputter. He turns for home. Part 12. Rescue and Revelation. Before dawn the next morning, Lewis is back. He has slept perhaps 2 hours. He has refueled, rearmed, and returned to the sky before the sun rose. He leads a PBY Catalina, a flying boat designed for exactly this kind of rescue, to the crash site. 13 people are still floating in their life rafts, cold, scared, exhausted, but alive. Everyone accounted for, everyone alive. As the survivors are pulled aboard the Catalina, Louis circles overhead, providing cover against any Japanese aircraft that might appear. He does not know yet that one of the passengers is a woman named Svetlana. He does not know that he had a date with her the night before, a date he had to cancel because of this mission. He does not know that she is the niece of Dmitri Shostakovich, the famous Russian composer, that she was born in Harbin, Manchuria, that her stepfather was a United States Marine who brought the family to America before the Japanese invaded. He does not know any of this. He only knows that 12 people are alive because he made the hardest choice of his life. Later that day, the survivors are debriefed. When they learn what happened, when they learn that an American pilot shot down their plane to save them from capture, they are stunned. One of the nurses finds Lewis at the officers' club that evening. "You're the one," she says. "You're the pilot." Louis nods, uncomfortable with the attention. "You shot us down." "I did." "You saved our lives." Louis looks at her, really looks. She has dark hair and bright eyes and a smile that does something strange to his chest. "I'm glad you made it," he says. General George Kenney commands Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. When the report of what happened reaches his desk, he summons Lewis to his office. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," the general says. "You shot down an American aircraft." "Yep, Wixer." "Destroyed government property." "Yes, sir." "And saved 12 lives in the process." "Yes, sir." The general studies Lewis for a long moment, then a smile breaks across his face. "I'm awarding you the Air Medal," he says, "for shooting down a friendly aircraft." He pauses. "I told him I hoped he wouldn't feel called upon to repeat that performance. On the nose of Bad Angel, the ground crew adds a new kill marking, a small American flag, 4 nations, 4 flags, German, Italian, Japanese, American. No other pilot in World War II can make that claim." Part 13. The Girl in the Life Raft. Her name was Svetlana Valeria Shostakovich Brownell. Born in Harbin, Manchuria, to a Russian immigrant family. Her uncle was one of the most famous composers of the 20th century. Her stepfather was a Marine who saw what the Japanese were doing in Asia and decided his family needed to be in America. She became an army nurse because she wanted to help, because she could not stand to be safe at home while others suffered. Because something in her something that drove Louis Kurds, refused to accept the limitations that others accepted. On February 10th, 1945, she had been on her way to Manila. A routine transport flight, Nothing dangerous. Then the storm hit. Then the radio died. Then she found herself floating in the Philippine Sea, watching a Mustang circle overhead, wondering how her life had come to this. She found Louis again a few days later. "I need to thank you properly," she said. "You don't need to thank me at all. You saved my life. I shot down your plane. Both things are true." Louis looked at her, really looked, and something in his chest shifted. "Buy me dinner," he said. "We'll call it even." Here is what we learn about love in extreme circumstances. It is not soft. It is not gentle. It is not the slow accumulation of comfortable moments and shared routines. It is forged in fire. It is born in crisis. It is the recognition of one soul by another in the midst of chaos. Louis Kurds and Svetlana Brownell met because he shot down her plane. Their first conversation happened because he almost killed her. Their relationship was built on the most violent foundation imaginable, and yet, Part 14, After the War, April 13th, 1946, Allen County, Indiana. Louis Kurds marries Svetlana Brownell. The ceremony is small, family and close friends, no fanfare, no newspaper coverage, just two people who found each other in the most impossible way imaginable, making promises they intend to keep. Louis stays in uniform after the war. The Berlin airlift, 1948 to 1949, he flies C-54 Skymasters into Tempelhof, one of the most dangerous airports in the world. The approach requires threading through a narrow corridor of Soviet-controlled airspace, descending steeply over apartment buildings, landing on a runway barely long enough to stop a heavy transport, 277 days of round-the-clock operations, 2.3 million tons of supplies, an entire city kept alive by pilots who refuse to quit. Louis flies, mission after mission after mission. He is older now, slower. The reflexes that made him an ace at 23 have dulled with time and responsibility. He has a wife waiting for him at home, children on the way. But some things do not change. The determination that drove him through 9 months in the Italian mountains, the courage that made him dive into 50 German fighters to save a single wingman, the willingness to do what must be done, regardless of the cost. These things do not fade with age, they only deepen. October 1963, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Kurds retires from the United States Air Force. 22 years of service, 2 wars, countless missions, 9 aerial victories against 4 different air forces, 9 months as an escaped prisoner of war, hundreds of flights into besieged Berlin. He starts a construction company, builds houses instead of shooting down planes. The years pass. Louis and Svetlana raise 2 children. They grow old together in Fort Wayne, in the same city where Louis once stood in a muddy field and dreamed of flight. Their life is quiet, ordinary, full of small moments and everyday kindnesses. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is dark and sleep will not come, Louis thinks about that day over the Philippine Sea, 15 seconds, the C-47 descending toward the Japanese airfield, his finger on the trigger, the choice that was not really a choice at all. He never regrets it. Not once in 50 years does he wish he had done anything differently. Because Louis Kurds understands something that most people never learn. The right choice and the easy choice are almost never the same. Part 15. The End and the Beginning, February 5th, 1995. Fort Wayne, Indiana. Louis Kurds dies at 75 years old. They bury him at Lindenwood Cemetery, beneath a headstone that cannot capture everything he was. 9 aerial victories. 4 national flags. Prisoner of war escaped. 9 months behind enemy lines. Berlin airlift. Veteran. The only American pilot ever decorated for shooting down an American plane. The woman he saved, the woman who became his wife, outlives him by 18 years. Svetlana Kurds dies in October 2013. They bury her beside him, together forever. The pilot and the girl from the life raft. Part 16. The Mathematics of Courage. Let us count the cost of February 10th, 1945, 12 Americans on that C-47, 0 survivors if they had landed, 12 survivors because a 25-year-old pilot made a choice no manual ever covered. But the mathematics of courage are not so simple. Louis Kurds did not save 12 people that day. He saved everyone who would ever come from those 12 people. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, generations upon generations, spreading out through time like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. One of the women he saved became his wife. His children exist because he pulled that trigger, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. When you save a life, you do not save one person. You save entire worlds that have not yet been born. And when you lose a life, the mathematics work the same way. The 3 German pilots. Louis shot down on his first mission. They had families too, futures, descendants who will never exist because Louis Kurds was faster, better, luckier. This is the terrible arithmetic of war. Every victory is someone else's tragedy. Every life saved requires other lives to be risked or taken. Every hero's journey is paved with graves. Louis Kurds understood this. He carried it with him every day of his life. It did not make him less heroic. It made him more human. Part 17. The Lessons. What can we learn from the life of Louis Kurds? First, prepare before the storm. Louis enlisted the day before Pearl Harbor, not because he knew what was coming, but because he trusted his own judgment. He saw the clouds on the horizon and acted while others waited. The best time to prepare for crisis is before crisis arrives. The best time to develop skills, build character, and forge determination is when life is calm enough to allow for practice. When the storm comes, and it always comes, you will not have time to become who you need to be. You will only have time to be who you already are. Second, the choices that matter most come without warning. Louis had 15 seconds to decide whether to shoot down that C-47. 15 seconds between 12 lives saved and 12 lives lost. There was no time for deliberation, no time for moral philosophy. The choice emerged from everything he had ever been, everything he had ever done, everything that had shaped his character over 25 years of life. We like to believe that we will rise to the occasion when tested. But the truth is simpler and more demanding. We do not rise. We fall to the level of our training, our habits, our deepest beliefs about who we are and what matters. Build yourself now for the moments that will come without warning. Third, sometimes the right choice looks wrong. Shooting down an American plane is wrong. It violates every rule, every instinct, every norm of military conduct. But letting 12 Americans be captured by the Japanese, knowing what that capture would mean, is more wrong. Sometimes we face choices where every option involves harm, where there is no clean path, where the best we can do is choose the least terrible outcome. These choices are not evidence of moral failure. They are evidence that we live in a complex world where simple rules cannot cover every situation. Have the courage to make the hard choice. Have the wisdom to accept that no choice is perfect. Fourth, relationships forged in crisis have a different kind of strength. Lewis and Svetlana met because he shot down her plane. Their love story began with violence, fear, and near death, and yet they stayed married for 49 years. Because relationships built in extremity are built on truth. There is no pretense when your life is in danger. No games when you are floating in the Philippine Sea. No illusions when you owe your existence to someone's willingness to pull the trigger. The couples who survive crisis together often find that nothing afterward can shake them. They have seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay. They have faced death and decided that life together is worth fighting for. Fifth, the measure of a life is not in its comfort, but in its meaning. Louis Kurds could have come home after his escape from Italy. He could have accepted his status as a hero, taken a desk job, and lived out the war in safety. Instead, he volunteered for more. Not because he wanted glory, not because he enjoyed killing, but because there was work to be done, and he was capable of doing it. And that capability created an obligation he could not ignore. A comfortable life is not necessarily a meaningful life. A safe life is not necessarily a good life. Sometimes meaning requires risk. Sometimes purpose demands sacrifice. Find the thing that matters enough to risk yourself for, then risk yourself. Sixth, the small acts of courage enable the great ones. Louis Kurds did not become the man who could make that 15-second decision overnight. He became that man through thousands of smaller decisions. The decision to enlist before others saw the danger. The decision to excel in training when he could have coasted. The decision to break formation and save a wingman in his first combat mission. The decision to keep walking for 9 months through the Italian mountains. The decision to volunteer for the Pacific when he had earned his rest. Each of these decisions was a small act of courage. Together, they built the character that could make the great one. Seventh, love is the answer to the hardest questions. Why did Lewis pull that trigger? Because he knew what capture meant. Because he could not watch 12 people disappear into horror when he had the power to stop it. Because the cost of action, however terrible, was less than the cost of inaction. But there is another answer, a simpler one. Because love for his fellow Americans, love for the innocent, love for the idea that life is precious and worth protecting, even at great cost. And in the end, that love came back to him. One of the people he saved became the love of his life. His act of violence became the foundation of a family. This is the strange alchemy of courage when you give yourself for others. You often receive more than you gave. The final word. On February 10th, 1945, a pilot from Indiana faced an impossible choice. He had 15 seconds. He had no time to think, no manual to consult, no commanding officer to ask. He had only himself, the person he had become through 25 years of choices, challenges, triumphs, and failures. And that self was enough. Louis Kurds pulled the trigger. 12 Americans splashed down in the Philippine Sea instead of disappearing into Japanese captivity. One of them became his wife. Their children and grandchildren walk the earth today because of a decision made in 15 seconds. That is not just a war story. That is not just a love story. That is a story about what it means to be human, about the choices we make when there is no time for deliberation, about the character we build in quiet moments that reveals itself in crisis, about the strange mathematics of courage, where saving lives sometimes requires taking risks that seem insane, about love found in the most impossible places, forged in fire, tested by time, strong enough to last half a century. So I ask you, who are you becoming? What choices are you making today that will shape the person who faces tomorrow's crisis? Are you building character or coasting? Are you preparing or waiting? Are you becoming someone who can pull the trigger in 15 seconds, not because it is easy, but because it is right? The story of Louis Kurtz ended in 1995 at a cemetery in Fort Wayne, Indiana. But the lessons of his life do not end. They continue in everyone who hears this story and decides to become someone worthy of it. They continue in you. If this story has moved you, do not let the feeling fade. Write down one thing you will do differently because of what you have learned, one choice you will make, one habit you will build, one act of courage you will attempt, then go do it. Not tomorrow, today. Because Louis Kurtz did not have 15 seconds of warning. Neither will you. 4 flags, 4 nations, 1 pilot, 1 choice, 1 love, and a life that proved what humans are capable of when they refuse to accept the impossible. Disclaimer. This story is created solely for educational and informational purposes. It aims to provide relationship guidance and awareness, not to target or identify any individual. The events and characters depicted are entirely fictional, intended for entertainment and learning. Our content is advertiser-friendly and does not promote hate, offense, or harm in any form. The goal is to help viewers gain insights and make informed decisions based on life experiences,